Welcome back to Mastering the Ablative Case in Latin, 20 Uses Made Easy. We started this course by observing that in classical Latin, the ablative case combines what were originally three different cases. There is the original ablative, which expressed the relationship of separation, the from relationship, an instrumental associative case, which expressed the with relationship, and there was also a locative case, which expressed the in relationship. Previously, we looked at uses of the ablative that express separation. So now we're going to take a look at those uses of the ablative that express instrumental or associative relationship, the with ablatives. And we're going to start today with the ablative of means.
So the instrumental case is a common feature of many ancient languages, including Old English and Sanskrit. Today we still see an instrumental case in Russian. In classical Latin, the instrumental case has been absorbed into the ablative. So we can still see it, or we can see its descendants, in the ablatives of means, manner, and accompaniment, as well as in some less obvious uses such as the ablatives of degree of difference, price, and some others. The first use that comes to mind when we think of the instrumental ablatives is probably the ablative of means, which is also called the ablative of instrument. This is perhaps the most basic instrumental use of the ablative, and it's the most obvious. It denotes the means, that is, the tool or instrument with which an action is accomplished. It is never used with a preposition. It's simply the noun in the ablative case. So very often the ablative noun is a physical thing, as when Cicero, in his Tusculan Disputations, describes the Spartan youth as fighting with fists, heels, nails, and even with teeth. So notice here are the means of their fighting. Pugnis, calcibus, unguibus, morsuque, right? Those are our means. It is also possible to use abstract nouns in the ablative of means, as in the published version of Cicero's Pro Milone, where he says, Vi victivis vel potius oppressa virtute audacia est. Violence was conquered by violence, vi, or rather, boldness overwhelmed by virtue, virtute. So you'll notice in this example, as in other examples of the ablative of means, the noun in the ablative case is essential to the action. It's not just a descriptive term like it would be an ablative of manner or something like that. Without the virtue, violence would prevail. Okay, so let's take a minute to look at the difference between ablative of manner and ablative of means. Okay, we can think of a man driving a nail. We can say he drives the nail with enthusiasm. Clavum cum studio infigit. Notice enthusiasm is simply descriptive. He can still drive the nail without it, although perhaps not as decisively. And that is clavum infigit. He drives the nail. All right. Now, we specify the actual means, however, when we say clavam malio infigit. He drives the nail with a hammer. The hammer is a necessary part of the process. Without it, the nail is going nowhere. Ouch! In addition to clearly instrumental uses such as those above, Latin uses the ablative of means with verbs of filling and abounding. For instance, the prophet Isaiah says, Plena est omnis terra gloria eius. The whole earth is filled with his glory. Likewise, Horace refers to forum api defertum nautis calponibus aquae malignis, the forum api crammed with bargemen and stingy shopkeepers. So we can think of the filling or the stuffing as the means with which something is filled. So an application of the ablative of means that might be less obvious to us English speakers is the use of the ablative with the deponent verbs utor, fruor, fungor, potior, and vescor. We may just think of these as verbs whose direct objects just happen to be in the ablative case. When Salus says, for instance, that the inhabitants of Capsa in North Africa, lacte et farina carne vescebantur, we might as well translate that, or we normally would translate that, as they consumed milk and wild meat.
But grammatically, these aren't objects in Latin. Originally, these verbs would have been in the middle voice, as we'd find in classical Greek, which doesn't really exist in Latin anymore, but it kind of does. They're really middle voice, and so they're used reflexively.
So, for instance, a more literal translation of vescebantur, at least as it was originally understood, would be they were feeding themselves, or they fed themselves with milk and wild meat. They fed themselves by means of milk and wild meat. In like manner, if we return to an earlier example, I use a hammer. Originally, utor would have meant something like I employ myself. I employ myself by means of a hammer. A final variation that's generally considered a use of the ablative of means is the ablative with opus or usus. The usual translation of opus est or usus est is there is a need for. So, for example, in Virgil's Aeneid, when we see nunc veribus usus, now there is a need of strength, a need for strength. But how is that ablative of means? It doesn't really sound like it, right? The operative idea seems to be that there is work that needs to be done by means of strength. We sometimes see the perfect passive participle as a part of this construction, as when a character in one of Plautus's plays says, opus facto est viatico, there is a need of making provision. This is a much shorter way of saying there is work that needs to be done by means of provision having been made. But this is much shorter.
All right, so there's the ablative of means. In our next lesson, we're going to take a look at the ablative of manner. See you there. Valete.